Terraria Spooky Mod is, in my opinion, one of the most underrated mods this game has to offer, and subsequently doesn't really have any guides out there to help you on your journey. Because of this, I decided to compile everything you need to know about this mod start to finish in this comprehensive guide. And yes, this video is timestamped so you can easily navigate to each section. Anyway, I hope you'll enjoy, and without any more wasted time, let's get into the video. Upon joining your world for the very first time, you'll find yourself in a brand new biome called the Spooky Forest, which isn't just for looks, as upon exploring your surroundings, you'll come across a custom structure with an NPC called Littlebone. This NPC will give you general advice on the next steps you should be making, so if you ever find yourself stuck, you can simply ask Littlebone for some help. Though if you still know what you should be doing afterwards, you can always find your way back to this video. From here, you can chop down a couple trees where you can get yourself old wood, which can be used in several custom crafting recipes such as old wood armor, along with several weapons such as the old wood greatsword, the old moss bow, the old wood slingshot, and the old wood staff, which you're most certainly going to need in order to survive your first night, seeing as this mod adds quite a few new monsters. Speaking of which, the monsters you'll come across in this biome are as followed: the putty slime, zomboid, zomboid warlock, rooted zomboid, monster eye, along with the fuzzbat. In hard mode, this list expands a little further by adding the flaming root zomboid, evil witch, possessed scarecrow, along with the putty pumpkin. While on the topic of pumpkins, you may have noticed that there's a ton of them which naturally grow in this biome. However, upon breaking them, you'll get absolutely nothing. That is, unless you break one of these rotting pumpkins, in which case you'll get yourself a rotten seed, which can be used to spawn the first custom boss, Gourd, who we'll be getting back to in just a moment. Another thing you may have come across while exploring your surroundings is an absolutely massive pit, which I'm going to be using as a segue into the next segment of this video, the Spooky Underground. Here in the Spooky Underground, you'll come across most of the same monsters as the surface, along with the added giant fuzzbat here and there, though that's not what's important. What is important, however, are these 5 abandoned structures, each of which with a chest containing some pretty cool early game loot, such as a melee weapon called toilet paper, a mage weapon called necromancy for dummies, a ranged weapon called the pump action leaf blower, along with 2 accessories. While down here, I'd also like to point out that all the stone has been replaced with mossy stone, which can be used to craft the old moss bow I mentioned earlier, along with making old wood arrows and mossy pebbles for the various slingshots this mod adds. Also, there's a ton of ores down here, like a ton of ores, which is perfect for upgrading your armor and weapons early on. Continuing downwards, you can also find a new biome, which I can't find an official name for, so I'll just call it the Spooky Glowshroom biome, as that's the main item you can get while down here. With these Spooky Glowshrooms, you can make yourself a new mage armor set, a whip called the Spore Smacker, a melee weapon called the Fungal Flail, along with a statue of the Mushroom God. I don't know why this item exists, but hey, it exists. Anyway, I'm assuming that from here, you've explored a bit of your world and even defeated the Eye of Cthulhu, and with a loadout looking something like this, I think you should be ready to fight the Gourd. This fight is broken into 4 stages, with the first attack pattern being pretty simple. 3 normal stomps, 1 big stomp, followed by a swarm of flies while above 3/4 health. Once you get Gourd into his second phase, his attack pattern pretty much stays the exact same, but is altered ever so slightly, as after the 3rd normal stomp, Gourd will now produce mold spores before resuming the cycle as it was before. Upon getting Gourd down to half health, his attack pattern will once again be ever so slightly altered, this time starting out with the typical 3 stomps, mold spores, big stomp, and fly swarm, but after this you'll have another set of 3 normal stomps before a rapid 3 powerful stomps, which creates a bunch of dirt debris you need to dodge for obvious reasons. For the 4th and final phase of the fight, Gourd will ascend into the air and stomp 3 times before sending a volley of flies from the sky, and while the flies are raining down on you, Gourd will stomp twice more before repeating this cycle. Overall, this fight is pretty simple, and you should easily find yourself beating this boss. With Gourd finally defeated, you'll be rewarded with an accessory called the Charm of Flies, which honestly isn't even that good, the Gourd carving kit, which you can use to carve pumpkins, the rusted compass, which I'll be talking a little bit more about in just a moment, along with moldy chunks and an item called pumpkin guts. In order to place the pumpkin guts, you're going to need to make some bloom soil using any kind of dirt along with some of your moldy chunks, and from here this plant will eventually grow into what's called a bloom, which is basically a food item which provides you specific bonus stats for a certain amount of time, with all active blooms displayed in this box. Other uses for your moldy chunks are a not so great melee armor set along with a couple new weapons, Jerry's Book of Stinkology, Roddy's Wrath, the Stinky Slinger, along with the Branch of Gourd. During the playthrough of this mod I recently did, I found that of these weapons, the Book of Stinkology is honestly the best one by far, and I would suggest you make this for yourself, as pairing with a full set of jungle armor makes it really overpowered for quite a lot of free hard mode. Anyway, remember that rusted compass you just got? Well, if you hold it while it's in your hotbar, a compass will appear above your head pointing you to the next biome, the Spider Grotto. Once you find this biome, you'll notice a couple things. First of all, this place is massive, and second, in the center of this biome, there's an interesting structure where you can find a giant web with 4 item slots. The 4 items you need to find and return to this web are the old hunter's hat, skull, torso, and legs, all of which are randomly scattered throughout the grotto. The best way to find these 4 items is to look for this faint glow, as Spelunker potions don't make any difference, but once you find each item, you can either insert them into the web one at a time, or you can wait to put them all in at once. Either way, once all these items are placed into the web, you'll be greeted with this animation for a couple seconds before finally getting your reward, an NPC which sells not so great items, but hey, at least you can buy yourself a new bloom plant if you'd like. Before leaving this biome, I also want to talk about the mobs here along with the loot you can get. In pre-hard mode, there's 6 different types of spiders you can come across, though some of these spiders have different variants, such as the jumping spider with 2 variants, the orb weaver 3, and the tiny spider with 5. While every spider in this biome, at least in pre-hard mode, has a chance to drop an item called spider chitin, a couple of them have other items they can drop as well, such as the spider, which can drop the swingable spider, the red and white orb weaver, which can drop the spike shell basher, and the yellow and black orb weaver, which can drop the staff of the weaver. In hard mode, you can come across several more spiders, such as the giant orb weaver, the 3 tarantula hawks, the whip spider, along with the 2 trapdoor spiders. And while these spiders can't drop spider chitin, every single one of them can drop other unique items, such as the giant orb weaver, which can drop both the weaver ring along with the scepter of the weaver, the tarantula hawk variants, which can either drop the spider wing longbow or the grimoire of the flies, depending on which one you kill, the whip spider, which can drop the pheromone stinger, and lastly the trapdoor spiders, which can drop a mount called the old saddle, allowing you to walk on walls and even the ceiling. Other than the items you can get directly from the spiders, you can also craft yourself quite a few things as well, but first you're going to want to collect some roots, web blocks, and the spider chitin mentioned earlier. With web and chitin, you can craft yourself a new armor set called the Spy Ops armor along with a bunch of weapons, the spider stabber, spider egg cannon, venomous crossbow, web flinger, arachnid leg wand, and the strange spider egg. With roots, you really can't craft much, but if you're a ranger, you can make yourself a new armor set, which despite not having much defense, has a chance for your projectiles to heal you, and while I think this set honestly sucks, you do you. From here, I'm going to once again assume that you've gone ahead and beaten the Brain of Cthulhu / Eater of Worlds, along with having defeated the Goblin army. So with an inventory looking something like this, I think you should be ready for the next boss, the Spooky Spirit. In order to spawn the Spooky Spirit, we're first going to need to find another custom biome called the Swampy Cemetery, which is pretty easy to find as it always spawns inside of the jungle biome. However, before we actually go summon the Spooky Spirit, I first want to talk about this biome as there's quite a bit to talk about. First of all, this biome introduces a bunch of new mobs, such as a mob called Ghost, which becomes a bloated ghost when a player is nearby, the Hungry Ghost, which is somewhat similar to the bloated ghost as it opens its extremely large mouth when a player is nearby, the Devious Ghost, Happy Ghost, Sad Ghost, Mist Ghost, along with the Zombino and Zomboid Casket. While these are all the mobs which normally spawn in this biome, there's a chance every night for the graveyard to turn into the Raveyard, introducing a bunch of friendly NPCs which will make numerous skeleton puns if you talk to them. And while there are countless NPCs which spawn during this event, I want to focus on 3 of them: the Music Man, the Suspicious Skeleton, and the Skeleton Bouncer. When talking with the Music Man, you'll have the option to buy various vinyl records which will play songs when equipped along with the masks of the Spooky Mod developers. Also, this NPC is based off of BananaLizard, the person who made most of the songs for this mod, who I'd highly recommend you check out as he's extremely underrated. The next NPC, the Suspicious Skeleton, is pretty similar to the Music Man, and by that I mean this is the only other NPC from this event which has an item shop. This NPC will sell you various contraband items and will update his shop after every boss you kill from this mod. And if you collect all of these contraband items, you can craft yourself 2 accessories, the Apocalypse Mixtape along with the Creepypasta, neither of which I've legitimately made as their post-Moonlord items and I honestly couldn't have been bothered to make them. Lastly, we have the Skeleton Bouncer, who at first glance is not all that remarkable as he doesn't have an item shop. However, if you end up killing this NPC, you'll get yourself an incredibly overpowered weapon called the Spooko 2 Necromantic Machine Pistol, which you can get at any point in the game. And when I say overpowered, I mean overpowered. However, there's a slight catch. Not only does this NPC have bit integer defense, but once you deal even a singular damage to any of the NPCs from this event, you'll immediately be gunned down without hesitation. While this NPC is incredibly difficult to kill, there are several cheeses I've discovered which make this fight pretty much completely free. However, after talking with some of the Spooky Mod developers, it seems that they intend on patching these sometime in the foreseeable future. But as of now, these are all the cheeses that I know about. Lava traps, which are quite slow but consistent, dodging behind the Music Man, standing off to the distance, using minions, and probably the most overpowered bug of them all, dart traps, which for some reason has a chance to deal several billion damage per hit, and that's billion with a B. However, seeing as this weapon was specifically made as a game-breaking item, I'm not going to be using it in this video, and I would highly advise that you don't use it either, as it completely skips the entire game's progression and will make your experience of this mod incredibly dull and unfun. Anyway, now that we've covered all of that, it's finally time to summon the Spooky Spirit, and to do so, we're going to need to grab a broken EMF reader from either of these small buildings and repair it with 5 Demonite / Crimtane along with 2 iron bars. And now that you have a fully functional EMF reader, all you need to do is wait for it to become night and right-click this glowing statue, and just like that, you've summoned the Spooky Spirit. When it comes to this boss fight, there's only 2 phases, but a lot more attacks you need to keep track of in comparison to the Rock Gourd, so I'll quickly run down these attacks along with giving some general tips on how to survive them. During the first phase, the Spooky Spirit cycles through 5 different attacks, the first of which having having the boss slowly following you for a couple seconds before quickly dashing towards you 3 times. Seeing as this dash is only horizontal and not vertical, I'd suggest upgrading your Hermes boots to either Spectre or Lightning boots, that way you can just hop over the boss, though you can also do this with any double jump item as well. For the next attack, the Spooky Spirit will spawn a barrage of phantom seeds which you can very easily evade by running in a straight line. That's it. It's actually a pretty simple attack actually. However, for the next attack, the Spooky Spirit will teleport in front of you and fire a spread of 7 projectiles a total of 5 times, and while you could dodge this attack by jumping in between the projectiles, I find the easiest ways to dash towards the boss when it first teleports. From here, the Spooky Spirit will do what I call the airstrike attack, spawning 3 sets of skull bombs which will rain down from the sky, and while this attack can be somewhat tricky to dodge in the open air, standing under a couple blocks will completely shield you from all harm. Lastly, for the 5th and final attack, the Spooky Spirit will circle around you, spawning even more projectiles before quickly dashing towards you a singular time, which you can once again dodge by simply dashing out of the way. And from here, this cycle will repeat until you get into the second phase. Speaking of which, once you get the Spooky Spirit below half health, you'll enter the second phase of the fight, which is very similar to the first half but with a couple small changes, adding a brand new attack along with slightly altering one of the previous ones. Also, I want to quickly add that the Spooky Spirit will not reset its attack pattern upon entering the second phase, but will rather continue the sequence from where it was left off. That being said, during the second phase, the first 2 attacks stayed the exact same, that being the one where the boss dashes at you 3 times along with the Phantom Seed attack. But from here, the Spooky Spirit has a brand new attack which will spawn 3 sets of quasi-homing skulls which you can pretty easily dodge with lightning boots along with your dash ability. Lastly, the only other change added in the second phase is during the very next attack, where after the typical 5 sets of 7 projectiles, the Spooky Spirit will attempt to beam you out of existence using a massive forehead laser. But if you can survive all of these attacks, you should find yourself beating this boss with no problems. Also, a quick fun fact I didn't know about until recording this video, but if you fight the Spooky Spirit while a rave is taking place, the Spooky Spirit and its attacks will change colors, something which has no effect on the fight itself, but something I find pretty cool regardless. Anyway, with the Spooky Spirit defeated, you'll be rewarded with the following: one of the 3 armor pieces from the Spirit Horseman set, the Spirit Amulet accessory, the Yellow Barrier Key, along with one of the following 4 weapons: the Spooky Buster, the Rod of Hands, the Ghostly Slingshot, and the Spooky Scroll. Also, while wearing the full set of Spirit Horseman's armor, your head literally pops off your body and helps you fight, and while that's a pretty cool gimmick, this set as a whole kinda sucks, so I personally wouldn't use it. Anyway, now that you have the Yellow Barrier Key, you can finally enter the Catacombs, where you'll quickly realize that you can barely see, and while you can place torches down here, you can't place down anything else, though for some reason, you can still break all the decorations, which, hey, free money, am I right? While in the Catacombs, you can come across several chests scattered throughout containing loot such as the Cat o' Nine Tails, the Rod of Ensnaring, the Harvester's Scythe, along with the Old Hunter's Crossbow. And honestly, all these weapons are pretty good for their respective classes. Other than the loot you can get from the chests here, you can also come across several mobs as well. And while there are a lot of unique mobs that spawn in the Catacombs, the only useful ones for you are the Gilded Skull, which drops several gold coins upon death, the Cube of Putty, which drops the Rusted Ring, Big John, who not only has a funny name but also drops an actually really good melee weapon called the Femur Fracturer, along with the Zomboid Necromancer and Pyromancer, each having a chance to drop the Skull Amulet. An accessory I think is kinda trash, but feel somewhat obligated to mention, seeing as this video is specifically made to cover all the features this mod has to offer. One last thing before we leave the Catacombs: if you make your way down to the very bottom, you'll come across a boss room with a giant sleeping flower hanging from the ceiling. This is a boss you can fight once you enter hard mode, but I just wanted to point out now, seeing as we'll be returning here later. Anyway, with the upper Catacombs looted, I'm going to assume that you've gone ahead and beaten Skeletron, and from here I want to introduce the 4th and final custom biome this mod has to offer: the Valley of Eyes. In order to find this final biome, you could technically use the fleshy compass from the old hunter back in the Spider Grotto, though that's completely unnecessary, as this biome always spawns in the underworld beneath the jungle, and trust me, you can't miss it. Either way, now that you're in the Valley of Eyes, you'll come across several new enemies: Bat and Eye, the Manhole, Mr. Handy, the Dortumor, and the Giant Tortumor, the first 3 having a chance to drop an accessory called Monster Blood, and the Giant Tortumors having a chance to drop a yo-yo called the Tumor Throw, and a summon weapon called the Gore Staff, depending on which variant you kill. While talking about the different loot you can get, if you chop down these eye trees, you can get yourself an item called Living Flesh, which when combined with Demonite or Chronotane bars can make a new summoner armor set along with several weapons: the Flesh Mincer, the Retina Staff, the Seer, along with the Eyelasher, with all of these weapons having upgrades later on once you enter hard mode. If you continue exploring this biome, you'll eventually come across this absolutely massive building, which is home to yet another NPC, Little Eye. Before the 1.2 update, Little Eye used to give you quests to craft several potion flasks. However, once 1.2 came out, this NPC was completely reworked and you now have to complete several bounties. Well, technically you don't have to complete these bounties, but once you start one, you can't cancel it and start another, and since we're already talking about the bounties, we may as well go do them. After starting the first bounty, you you need to head back to the spooky forest while having the red velvet cake in your inventory, and while it may take some time, you should eventually come across an absolute unit of a monster called Frank the Goblin. During this fight, Frank only has 2 attacks in the first phase, the first of which he'll extend his rotating hands towards you no matter how far away you are, and for a second attack will stomp on the ground 3 times, causing monster eye projectiles to pop out of the ground and bounce around a couple times before despawning. Once you get Frank below half health, the first 2 attacks stay the exact same. However, Frank will also now spawn into actual monster eyes after the second attack, and since these monster eyes don't despawn after a set amount of time, you're gonna need to get rid of them right away or else you'll quickly find yourself getting overwhelmed. For this fight, I personally like to use weapons which give me some sort of range advantage, so I'd recommend using the retina staff, the seer, the venomous crossbow, and the femur fracturer, though these are all just suggestions and you can use whatever you feel most comfortable with. Anyway, now that you've defeated Frank, you can head back to the Valley of Eyes where you can collect the reward for all of your hard work, an accessory which is complete trash. However, with the first bounty completed, you can now start the second one, this time needing to return to the swampy cemetery. Much like Frank the Goblin, it may take a while for the mob to spawn, but eventually you should come across the Tome of Spirits, which if you get close enough to, will summon 3 enemies: Rarg, Greenie, and Blueford. During this fight, Rarg will always attack first, spawning 9 Phantom Fist projectiles which you can simply dodge by jumping up and down. Next, Greenie will summon 3 sets of 2 Magic Blasts, which I find to be a little more difficult to consistently dodge, seeing as their movement is somewhat randomized. However, using your dash and double jump abilities should be sufficient enough. Lastly, we have Blueford, who doesn't actually have an attack of his own unless both Rarg and Greenie are already dead. However, every now and then he'll give a protective shielding to one of the other spirits, having the amount of damage to take while it's active. Now that we've introduced the contestants, there's something that you should know. Once any of the spirits die, the remaining ones get stronger, so if you kill either Greenie or Blueford, Rarg will now fire off 12 Phantom Fists at a faster rate along with dashing towards you once afterwards. However, if you kill both Greenie and Blueford, Rarg will now spawn 17 Phantom Fists at an even faster rate, but still only dashes at you a singular time. Alternatively, if you were to kill either Rarg or Blueford first, Greenie will now spawn 3 sets of 3 Magic Blasts, followed by another larger blast which splits into 5 smaller projectiles. And if you end up killing both Rarg and Blueford, Greenie will once again spawn 3 sets of 3 Magic Blasts, this time at a faster rate, but will now spawn 2 of the splitting attacks. As I had mentioned earlier, if you end up killing both Rarg and Greenie, Blueford will finally start attacking you, first starting off by spawning 5 homing crosses, followed by 4 quick bursts of 3 projectiles. And personally, my advice for this fight as a whole is to lower all 3 of the spirits' health simultaneously, that way you don't have to deal with any of the enraged variants. Though if I had to pick, I'd say taking down Greenie first, Blueford second, and Rarg third would probably be the easiest way to go about things. Once you defeat all 3 spirits, you can once again make your way back to Little Eye, who will give you an actually somewhat decent item, this being an accessory which allows you to spawn any of the 3 spirits to fight for you, and to toggle between them, just left click the accessory while holding it and the spirit that spawns will be indicated by the color of the eye on the item itself. For the third bounty, you're going to need to head back to the Spider Grotto. However, unlike the previous bounties we've done already, this mob, Stitches, doesn't just stand still and wait for you to find it, but rather it'll eventually find its way into your general area, though to actually start the fight, you still need to be the one to attack first. During this fight, Stitches only has 4 attacks in the first phase, the first of which isn't really much of an attack, seeing as Stitches will slowly follow you for a couple seconds, doing pretty much nothing. However, during the second attack, Stitches will scurry away before quickly dashing directly at you a singular time. To dodge this attack, you can either try to dash out of the way, which is quite consistent in an open area, or if you absolutely need to, dash directly into the attack, seeing as your Shield of Cthulhu will give you a couple immunity frames. From here, Stitches will once again slowly follow you, but unlike the first attack in the cycle, will now shoot out webs which will temporarily freeze you in place. And from here, the fourth attack is very similar to the second one, but instead of dashing once, Stitches will now dash towards you twice. If you can survive all 4 of these attacks, you can survive for at least half of the fight, seeing as the cycle will repeat until you can get into the second phase. And speaking of which, once you get Stitches below half health, the second phase of the fight will officially begin, and it's honestly very similar to the first half. However, the fourth attack now goes from 2 dashes to 3, and a 5th attack is added to the cycle where a bunch of these bright orange projectiles will shoot out in your general direction. Overall, this fight isn't all that difficult, and you should find yourself beating Stitches in no time at all. Anyway, with Stitches defeated, you can head back to Little Eye to claim your rewards. An honestly really good fishing rod along with an accessory which looks really promising at first glance, but honestly isn't all that good. The reason why I personally don't like the Stitch Cloak is because it has a 10-second cooldown and is also completely overridden by the Shield of Cthulhu. Plus, that web is not going to catch anything. Look at the size of it. For the 4th and final bounty of Hardmode, you're already where you need to be, as this mob spawns in the Valley of Eyes. And I'm not going to say the name of this mob, seeing as I don't want some random Twitter user with hearing problems to take what I said out of context. Anyway, during this fight, the enemy which shall not be named has 3 main attacks. The first attack consisting of 3 harmless projectiles, which after a couple seconds turn into eye runes. From here, each eye rune will spawn an additional 3 more projectiles before despawning, these ones actually dealing damage this time. If you thought the first attack was easy to deal with, the second one is somehow even easier, as 6 eye projectiles will spawn and just circle you. That's it. The only time you can actually get hit during this attack is if you either actively walk into one of the projectiles or if you're unfortunately hit by one when it first spawns, but you can technically survive this entire attack by standing completely still. The third and final attack of this cycle is slightly better in terms of not being completely broken, but is also very incredibly easy to dodge as a bunch of bouncy eye projectiles will rain down on you. And if you're on land, there's a good chance you might get hit by one or two of these, but if you're on a raised platform such as this, you honestly don't have anything to worry about. Once you get this mob down to half health, it'll spawn a phantom version of itself, who just like the main enemy does pretty much nothing. I'm not kidding. I mean, every now and then the phantom version will spawn a singular projectile, and sometimes the two will swap places, but this fight is honestly just, I don't know how to describe it. Disappointing? One last thing you should keep in mind though is that if you stand completely still for long periods of time, sometimes the game bugs out and the fight just ends. So while it is really tempting to try doing this fight without moving at all, I'd recommend moving at least a little bit here and there just so the fight doesn't prematurely end. Anyway, with all 4 bounties complete and with an inventory looking something like this, I think you should be ready for the third and final custom boss of pre-hard mode. But before you can do that, you're going to need to explore the Temple of Moco, where you have to clear several rooms full of mobs in order to advance to the next one. Also, while you're here, you can come across this painting called the Portrait of Baxter, which I was ever so kindly asked to include in this video by none other than Wasafi himself, who is not only the owner of this absolutely adorable feline, not only a fellow content creator, but also one of the Spooky Mod developers. I have no idea how this relates to Spooky Mod's main progression, but do with that information as you like. Anyway, after you've cleared all the rooms, you can now head back to the entrance of the temple in order to enter a room previously blocked off, where you'll come across a mini-boss called Nosferatu. During this fight, Nosferatu only has 4 attacks, however they're performed in no order whatsoever. Regardless, these 4 attacks are the following: a ram attack where Nosferatu will be dazed for a couple seconds after hitting the wall, a snot rain, 4 bouncy booger balls, and 2 enemies called Nogum which just bounce around dealing contact damage. Once you get Nosferatu below half health, he'll also summon several enemies from the rooms you just previously cleared, though this is a one-time ability, hence why I'm not counting as one of his attacks. As of recording this video, you can very easily dodge all of these attacks by simply placing a couple blocks, making a protective box such as this. Mind you, this method restricts the amount of weapons you can use, but weapons such as the retina staff, which I'd highly recommend for this fight regardless, can still be used. Assuming that you can defeat Nosferatu, you'll be granted with 2 items, the Snotbug wings and the cotton swab. And while I personally don't think the wings are worth using, I don't really prioritize mobility in this game to begin with, so you should take that with a grain of salt. As for the cotton swab, you can use this item at the Nose God Shrine in order to finally summon the next boss, Moco. For the first phase of this fight, Moco has 5 unique attacks in the following order. First, Moco will quickly dash at you 2 times, which you can easily dodge by flying up and down. From here, Moco will fly above you and rain down snot globs, but seeing as Mako is completely stationary during this attack, you can simply take a couple steps to the side and be completely unharmed. Though, keep in mind that these snot globs will take quite a long time to disappear, so I'd advise bringing Mako away from your arena entirely during this attack. For the third attack, Mako will spawn a bouncing snot ball, which will bounce towards you several times before despawning. Next up is the fourth attack, which I personally think is probably the hardest to dodge in the first phase, as Mako will now shoot a bunch of snot projectiles at you at a relatively fast rate. For this attack, I mainly just try to fly in a half circle around Mako, though you still might get hit every now and then if you try doing this yourself. Lastly, for the fifth and final attack of the cycle, Mako will shoot his eyes out at you, which again, you can very easily dodge by taking a couple steps to the side. Once you get Mako down to half health, he'll do this quick animation before starting his second phase, and while the second phase is very similar to the first, there are now 7 attacks in the following order. For the first attack, Mako will dash at you twice just like he did for the first half of the fight, though admittedly this is a little harder to dodge seeing as the Mockwing which now surround Mako can and will get in your way. The second attack is virtually identical in both phases of the fight, though Mako will now fire a lot more snot globs at an even faster rate than before, so again, I'd advise leading Mako away from your arena during this attack. For the third attack, Mako will once again create a snot ball that bounces towards you. However, unlike the first phase of this fight, the snot ball will now explode into a bunch of snot globs, which just like the previous attack, linger around for quite some time. From here, Mako will once again rapid fire snot projectiles at you, but once this attack is done, Mako has 3 entirely new attacks. The first of these new attacks is that the Mockling which surround Mako will now dive bomb you, something you can pretty easily and consistently counter by running in a straight line. For the next attack, Mako will turn to his side and sneeze around the world. Well, technically he doesn't go around the entire world, but you get the idea. This causes a large blast of snot to shoot out at you, which you honestly just kinda need good RNG to not get hit. Lastly, for the final attack of the cycle, several Mockling will fly towards you trying to deal contact damage. However, the only Mockling that will actually fly at you are the ones glowing red, so don't get distracted by the ones surrounding Mako. If you can survive all of these attacks, you should find yourself beating Mako in no time at all, granting you the Snot Globs, the Snotty Schnoz, any one of Mako's 4 weapons, and for only your first time beating this boss, a Sentient Heart which I'll be talking a little bit more about once you enter hard mode. Anyway, with the Snot Globs you just got, you can make yourself the same 4 weapons you can get from Mako. The Snot Ball, the Booger Blaster, the Snot-Nosed Tome, the Sneeze Scepter, along with a 5th weapon called the Sneezer. Other than these 5 weapons, you can also make yourself Booger Arrows, Mucus Bullets, Snot Rockets, the Nose Cultist Vanity Set, along with an item called the Nose Idol of Time Reversal, which you can use to reset the Temple of Moco. Speaking of which, if you reset the Temple of Moco and wear the Nose Cultist Vanity Set, you'll notice that not only are the enemies no longer hostile, but you can actually talk with them. And while the basic enemies don't really say much, if you talk with Nosferatu, you can give him one of your Snot Globs in return for his blessing, giving your attacks a chance to spawn Snot projectiles whose damage scales with your weapon. Anyway, now that Mako's defeated, you can finally go ahead and beat the Wall of Flesh. And seeing as I promised I was going to talk a little bit more about the Sentient Heart once you entered hard mode, I'm going to take a quick moment here to talk about the different weapons you can craft with this item. As of recording this video, there's a total of 20 weapons you can make using Sentient Hearts, 6 from pre-hard mode, 6 from pre-mech, and 8 more from post-Plantera. The 6 weapons you can make during pre-hard mode are the following: the Conscious Cutter, the Uncanine Bow, the Necronomicon, the Liquor, the Gargoyle Scepter, and the Sentient Shootius, all of which I didn't mention earlier as I feel they aren't all that great. However, upon entering hard mode, the 6 new weapons you can craft are the Tongue Blade, which you can switch between swinging like a normal sword and firing out Ichor, the Pendaloke, the Gator Gun, the Bubble Belcher, the Moocher Staff, along with an AoE weapon called the Soul Sucker, the last 2 being exclusive to Corruption and Crimson Worlds respectively, as their base weapons are dropped by Corruption and Crimson Mimics. In my opinion, the best weapons from this list are the Tongue Blade, the Bubble Belcher, and the Soul Sucker, and trust me, if you're playing on a Crimson World, you're going to want to get yourself the Soul Sucker regardless of what damage class you're playing as this weapon is perfect for crowd control and dealing with multi-segmented mobs and bosses. Lastly, once you beat Plantera, you'll be able to craft the following 8 weapons: Dave and Mike, the Molar Mauler, the Ooze Magnum, the Eye Belcher, the Carrion Chunker, the Necronomicon Volume 2, the Avian's Crux, along with the Living Caduceus. Okay, so you remember how earlier when we were in the Catacombs, we came across a boss we couldn't summon yet? Well, now that you're in hard mode, you can craft yourself a heavy brick with 15 clay, 2 souls of night, and 2 souls of light, which you can use to summon Daffodil. However, instead of jumping immediately into the fight, Daffodil will recite the entirety of the Iliad. So while we're waiting, this is the gear I'd recommend using. Anyway, once Daffodil is finally done with her monologue, the fight will officially begin, with the first of 6 attacks being a couple quick bursts of lasers, which you can pretty easily dodge by dashing from one end of the room to the other. For the second attack, Daffodil will spawn a bunch of leaf projectiles which will lock in on your current position, and from personal experience, the easiest way to dodge this attack is to once again move across the room. For the third attack, Daffodil will spawn several bulbs which will randomly bounce around the room for a couple seconds before eventually blooming into a bunch of flowers, and personally, I think this and the next attack are the hardest ones to dodge in the first phase due to their unpredictable behavior. Speaking of which, for the fourth attack, Daffodil will spawn a swarm of flies on both sides of the room, and while this attack is rather chaotic and unpredictable, I find the most consistent way to dodge this is to stand on top of either of these structures and jump up / fall down whenever necessary. Up next, for the fifth attack, Daffodil will cause a bunch of sprouts to fall from the ceiling which don't deal any damage themselves. However, after a couple seconds, these sprouts will turn into massive thorny vines, so just try to stand in an area mostly devoid of these sprouts if possible. Lastly, the sixth and final attack of the first phase is a massive eye laser which you can very easily dodge by hiding under the structures provided in this room. If you can survive all 6 of these attacks, you should quickly find yourself entering the second phase of this fight, where Daffodil will once again recite the entirety of Shakespeare before creating a thorn barrier preventing you from touching the floor and walls. For the second phase, Daffodil now has 7 attacks, with the first 4 being the exact same as the first half of this fight, that being the laser bursts, leaf projectiles, bouncing bulbs, and the fly swarm. But on the 5th attack, Daffodil will now try to Will Smith you out of existence. However, like many of the attacks from this fight, you can simply dash out of harm's way. For the 6th attack of the cycle, the ceiling sprouts make a return, but since we've already covered this, I'm just going to skip to the 7th and final attack, where Daffodil will channel the raw, unfiltered power of the sun to beam you out of existence. Assuming that you can survive all these attacks, you should find yourself beating this boss, granting you with the following: the flower hairpin accessory, the second place bloom ribbon which unlocks your 3rd bloom slot, a new bloom plant called the Puff of Pollen, the red barrier key, along with one of the following 4 weapons: the thorn dagger, the fly shot, the sunflower rod, along with a really good close range summon called the plant puncher staff. Anyway, now that you've beaten Daffodil, you can enter the lower catacombs where you'll come across a ton of new enemies such as the Ancient Crusher, Diva Dahlia, the Flush Bush, Popseed, the Muerto Skeletoid, Observing Orchid, Pollinator Bee, Skeletoid Bandit, Stalking Sunflower, Smelly, Spitcher Plant, Trapper Plant, and the Water Lily, with most of these mobs dropping plant chunks which can be used to craft the flower armor along with the 4 weapons dropped by Daffodil. Other than the mobs here, you'll also occasionally come across several chests containing loot such as the Bulb Bomb, the Hunter Soul Scepter, along with the Cross Charm, and if you come across and solve this lava puzzle, you'll be rewarded with the Idol of Flame. If you continue exploring the lower catacombs, you'll eventually stumble your way into the suspiciously large room with Pandora's box sitting in the center, which upon opening will start the Pandora's box event. Go Go figure. Despite this being a custom event, there's really not much to talk about. There's a total of 5 waves, with each wave getting progressively harder, culminating in a final fight against a mob called Chester. And if you complete this event, you'll be rewarded with one of the following accessories: Samson's Cuffs, the Cross, the Unholy Grail, along with the Ghastly Rosary. And when you combine all 4 of these items with 25 ectoplasm, you can craft yourself an accessory called the Malghoul. Also, if you continue further down, you'll come across another barrier blocking off the final room of the lower catacombs, requiring you to beat Gollum in order to get the orange barrier key. However, seeing as this final room is the summoning chambers for the 6th and final custom boss, and we haven't even covered the 5th boss yet, this room will have to wait. Speaking of which, now that you've gone ahead and beaten the 3 mech bosses, along with having an inventory looking something like this, it's time for you to fight the 5th boss this mod has to offer. But first, you need to head back to Little Eye to start the 5th and final bounty, where you'll be given an item called the Acidic Concoction. While you were exploring the Valley of Eyes earlier, I'm sure you came across this giant purple egg and wondered what it was. Well, now that you have the Acidic Concoction, when you right-click this egg, you'll end up starting another custom event called the Egg Incursion, requiring you to survive a brutal 6 whole minutes while fighting off the following mobs: the Tongue Biter, Hovering Brain, Popping Heart, Goose Lug, Flesh Bolster, Exploding Appendix, Earworm, Cruxbat, Coughing Lungs, along with a Biojetter, with these mobs having a chance to drop the following accessories: the Corroding Chompers, Two-Way Bloodway, Pepto-Bismol, Stone Kidney, Smoker's Lungs, along with a Symbiotic Ear. And if you combine all of these accessories with 50 Living Arteries, which I'll be talking a little bit more about in just a minute, you can craft yourself the total organ package. While I wish I could provide some advice for this event, it's pretty much just a test of skill, and while I'm sure there are cheeses out there somewhere, I personally don't know any. However, assuming that you can survive all 6 minutes, this event will finally come to an end. And from here, if you right-click the egg a second time, instead of starting the Egg Incursion, you'll end up spawning the 5th custom boss, Orro and Boro. For the first phase of this fight, there are a total of 6 attacks you need to keep track of in the following order. For the first attack, Orro and Boro will slowly follow you for a couple seconds before quickly dashing towards you, repeating this once more for 2 times in total. Next, Boro will quickly fly in a half circle around you. That's it. The third attack is somewhat similar to the first attack, but instead of 2 cycles, it's now 3, and whenever Orro and Boro dashes at you, a bunch of purple projectiles are ejected as well. Next up, for the 4th attack, you'll be transported into a game of Slither.io, and by that I mean Orro and Boro will circle you several times while simultaneously spawning even more projectiles. Speaking of projectiles, for the 5th attack, you'll have quite a few of them raining down upon you, but since this attack is very short, we're already onto the 6th and final attack of the first phase, where all you need to do is dodge a bunch of fleshy spikes whose spawning location is indicated by this gush of red particles. Anyway, once you get Orro and Boro down to half health, you'll enter the second and much harder phase of the fight, having Orro and Boro split into 2 separate entities, and when you have twice the amount of enemies, you have twice the amount of attacks. For the first of 6 attacks in the second phase, Orro will slowly follow you whilst Boro dashes horizontally 3 times. However, for the second attack, the roles are reversed as Boro will now be the one following you, while Orro is the one dashing vertically 3 times. For the third attack, we combine the best of both worlds, as both Orro and Boro will be dashing towards you before flying up into the sky, creating several projectiles you must dodge in the process. Next up, for the 4th attack, Orro will once again follow you, ejecting 3 sets of projectiles whilst Boro flies off screen in order to create the flesh spikes mentioned in the first half of the fight. However, for the 5th attack, it's time to switch things up again, as Orro will fly off screen in order to create a bunch of projectiles to rain down on you, while Boro, being the freak that he is, tries to lick you 9 times. Lastly, for the 6th and final attack, Orro and Boro will circle in on you, creating even more projectiles, which I must admit can be quite difficult to dodge, though thankfully, if you're quick enough, you can escape this attack entirely. Anyway, if you can manage to survive this absolutely chaotic mess of a boss fight, you'll be rewarded with the following: the Undying Embryo, Living Arteries, and any one weapon from each segment, meaning you'll get 2 weapons in total: the Chained Eyes, ICU, and Cycler from Orro, along with the Swarm Scepter, Leecher, and Venom Sprayer from Boro. Other than the items dropped from Orro and Boro directly, you can also craft yourself a few items with the Living Arteries you just got: 2 sets of Gore Armor, the 6 weapons from Orro and Boro, the total organ package mentioned earlier, the Strange Cyst, which can be used to restart the Egg Incursion, along with the upgraded versions of the Flesh Mincer, Retina Staff, Seer, and the Eyelasher. Anyway, now that you've gone ahead and beaten Gollum, along with having an inventory looking something like this, I think it's time to head back to the lower catacombs in order to open the final barrier, entering the spawning chambers for the 6th and final custom boss this mod has to offer, at least for now, Big Bone. In order to actually summon Big Bone, you're going to need to get yourself some freaky fertilizer, which thankfully you can find a couple of inside of the 2 barrels on either side of the room, but if you end up running out, you can always craft more using 2 beetle husks, 25 bones, along with 100 dirt. Anyway, back to the fight. During the first phase, Big Bone has 7 attacks along with 1 ability, with these attacks being 4 sets of red thorn vines, a bunch of skull wisps which will lock in on your current position, 3 flame bursts, a stationary attack called the Razor Rose, 3 sets of 5 flower projectiles, a bounce of bunching skulls, along with a headbutt attack, with the ability mentioned earlier being a bunch of healing flowers you must take down because, well, otherwise they'll heal the boss. What did you expect? However, there's a slight catch. Big Bone, unlike the other bosses this mod has to offer, doesn't perform these attacks in any particular order. In fact, they're completely random. Well, completely random except for the fact that you can't have the same attack happen twice in a row. Either way, if you manage to get Big Bone down to half health, you'll enter the second phase of this fight. But before you can actually attack Big Bone, you must first take down these 5 solar flowers in order to destroy Big Bone's protective shield. However, keep in mind that during this little intermission segment, Big Bone and the solar flowers can still attack you with Flower Spores and Solar Blast respectively. Once you take down all the solar flowers, you'll finally enter the second phase of the fight, which is pretty similar to the first half, except all the attacks from before have been completely revamped. Instead of the 4 red thorn vines, there's now a singular orange thorn looking wheel thingamajig which requires you to stay in specific places to not get hit. Skull wisps no longer home in on players, however a lot more spawned and are ejected out in random directions. The 3 flame bursts from earlier have been replaced with a singular larger burst which explodes into a bunch of bouncing flame projectiles. The razor rose now tracks player movements. The 3 sets of 5 flower projectiles are now 3 sets of 3 homing flowers, adds a lot more bouncing bones, along with keeping the headbutt attack the exact same. Also, the healing flowers have been replaced with defense flowers, greatly reducing the amount of damage Big Bone takes. Once you manage to defeat Big Bone, you'll be greeted with this epilepsy-inducing death animation for a couple seconds before finally being rewarded with the following loot: the Ancient Skull Mask, formerly known as the Disciple's Mask, the first place Bloom Ribbon unlocking your 4th Bloom slot, the Solar Sunflower Seed, along with one of the following 4 weapons: the Skull Smasher, which you can either throw normally with left click or charge up by holding right click, the Flame Orb Staff, which creates 5 bouncing flame projectiles with left click or a singular super powerful homing blast with right click, the Flower Shot, which rapid fires piercing roses with left click or a stationary thorn flower with right click, along with the Skull Totem, spawning in soul skulls when you left click, along with spawning a stationary skull idol at your cursor's position when you right click. While that concludes all the main content this mod currently offers, I want to take a quick moment to talk about a couple topics I couldn't previously fit in the video, the first of which being the custom biome chest you can find in the dungeon. If you manage to get the Spooky Forest key, Swampy Cemetery key, Spider Grotto key, along with the Eye Valley key, you'll be rewarded with a melee weapon called El Gordo, a magic weapon called the Disco Skull, a ranged weapon called the Venomous Spider Poon, along with a summoned weapon called Brainy in a Jar. These weapons are alright I guess, but I personally wouldn't go out of my way to go get them. Lastly, the actual final thing I'm going to be talking about are the bloom plants along with the various blooms you can consume and their abilities. As of making this video, there's a total of 6 bloom plants you can obtain, with these being Pumpkin Guts, which are dropped from Rock Gourd, the Snowberry Shrub, which can be bought from the Old Hunter, the Puff of Pollen, which is dropped by Daffodil, Dandelion Seeds, which are dropped by Pollinator Bees, the Diva Sprout, which is dropped by the Diva Dahlia, and lastly the Solar Sunflower, which is dropped by Big Bone. As for the actual blooms themselves, there's a whopping 20 currently in the game, and seeing as I've already sunk an ungodly number of hours working on this video, I'm gonna quickly speed through these, so please bear with me for a moment. The Watering Gourd, which gives you a chance to yield extra blooms, the Squash, which other than looking like a carbon copy of the Plants vs Zombies Squash, increases your damage by 15% while falling, the Pumpkin Dice, which spawns ghastly pumpkins every now and then, the Zappy Zucchini, which occasionally zaps nearby enemies, the Plump Gooseberry, which has a description way too long for my budgeting, so please pause here if you want to read it, the Blackberry Glacier, which gives a chance for any bloom you consume to last double its normal duration, the Very Blues, giving you a chance to inflict nearby enemies with frozen blueberry juice, which slows them down, the Mountain Strawberry, which occasionally will give you damage, critical strike chance, and knockback bonuses, the Bleeding Heart, which gives increased life regeneration depending on how many occupied bloom slots you have, the Thorn-Tipped Rose, giving you a protective or more so offensive ring of roses, which deal extra damage to enemies, the Monkey Orchid, which gives your weapons a chance to fire a spread of Monkey Orchid shurikens when used, the Dilated Iris, which other than spelling dilated incorrectly, spawns a petal and eye on your cursor, dealing more and more damage over time depending on how long they've been active for, the Dandelion Herd, spawning dandelion seed clusters whenever you're flying, the Whirlwind Maple Seed, which if used correctly can increase your flight time, the Tumbling Weed, which can sometimes cause tumbleweeds to spawn whenever you hit an enemy while flying, the Diva Dragon Fruit, which you can not only stack 10 times, which also stacks their duration, but also does whatever in Satan's overgrown leftmost fungal infested toenails going on over here, Sunny Side Up, who speeds up the growing process for all bloom plants for 5 minutes, the Multiple Lemon, which gives your weapons a chance to shoot out bouncy lemon bombs, the not so very annoying but rather angry Orange, who rather than pestering apples all day will instead pester enemies, which to doctors are pretty much the same exact thing, and lastly the Poker Pineapple, which increases damage dealt from critical hits by 35%, however also has your critical strike chance to begin with. Oh, we're done, okay. The video's come to an end, we've covered everything that the mod currently has to offer, and... oh, you gotta be kidding me!